Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for April 18th, 2013. I'm James Spencer. At Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about homebrewing. This week, a tribute to the late David Conz, professor at Arizona State University and friend to homebrewers and good beer in general. I'm going to skip the usual intro this week. I just finished editing this conversation with Dave Conz yesterday when I just happened to see his name pop up on Twitter. It was in a tweet from Rob Fullmer, president of the Arizona Society of Homebrewers, saying that Dave Conz had passed away. It seemed impossible, but when I checked Rob's feed, sure enough, there was a link to an article that he had written following Dave's death. Turns out Dave died this past Friday. The interview you'll hear today was recorded on March 28th. To get some perspective on who David Conz was, I asked Rob to help me introduce the interview. Rob Fullmer, welcome to Basic Brewing Radio, and my condolences on the loss of your friend.
Thank you, James. It's been tough here, but it's one of those situations where he had so many friends and so many connections, and that we're all able to support each other. And it's just not from the beer community. It's not just from his students at ASU. It's across the board. And maybe we can talk a little bit about all the other things he did. But yeah, it's been tough. But I think most of the reaction is how much he inspired people.
Yeah. How did you know Dave?
I knew him as a homebrewer. He was, as I got to be more involved in the community, in the homebrewing and the brewing community here in Arizona and Phoenix in particular. He was Dr. Beer. He had been teaching a cultural and chemical history of beer class, and he was looking to expand it. He was a home brewer. But if you look at his background, he got his BS in aerospace. He got his PhD in sociology. He was writing about nanotechnology. He was all over the map in terms of academics, but if you looked at all the other things he did, he raised his own chickens. He was a swing dancer. He was a poet. The thing that sort of lay in the background was beer.
Well, the thing that got my attention, or brought him to my attention, was an article he wrote in Slate, where he impressed me as the kind of guy who could step back and take a look at the big picture of things and kind of make some connections as to how things work through time. And he seemed like a big thinker who would be really interesting to talk to. And that's why I contacted him, because I said, boy, that's going to be a fun conversation. And it was, as you'll hear on the show. Is that how he came across in person?
Oh, absolutely. He if you really got into any subject matter, he could do as any professor could do, just make your head spin with detail and references. But he had his areas of just utter brilliance, but then he liked to sort of nest himself in between those areas of things he knew and things he was interested in, so that he could be sort of a teacher and a student at the same time. And I've come to learn a lot about him from talking to his friends and his colleagues, and he seemed to do that kind of thing in several areas of his life.
He seemed like a really upbeat person. I mean, I had a ball talking to him, and he seemed like a really positive person. Yeah,
and the unfortunate thing is he's a human being like any one of us, and he's susceptible to all the things that we are, and it's unfortunate. But I think he would want us to know that he chose a wrong path. It's looking like that he may have caused his own death, and I know people don't like to talk about that, but I think if Dave was to have survived, he would have said this is something that you should not do, especially when you have so many resources available to you, and everyone has those kinds of resources. So I know it's kind of still kind of raw right now, but I think we start to need to talk about that.
Yeah. Well, it's such a waste. That's the thing that's evident in the conversation is that, this is a special person with a lot to contribute, and you could tell that he enjoyed interacting with the students and really felt that he really felt that he had something to contribute. So, again, what a waste. And that
yeah. I agree. All I can say is we're all able to make good and bad decisions, and some of those are to take just an instance, and so that is a lesson that we're all going to have to learn as we also take his other inspiring qualities with us.
Yeah, we can't know what was going on in his mind, and all we can think of is the things that could have been. I'm gonna miss having the opportunity to speak to him again. I thought I was looking forward to, some sort of collaborations with him and his students, or we had talked after we had stopped recording about possibilities for the future, and that's I'm going to miss that. So
yeah, I think that's pretty much across the board with almost everyone I've talked to. I'd just like to say, I'd sort of like to close with a poem that was actually I learned about it through Larry Bell of Bell's Brewing. He's famously sort of ended evenings with it, and when Larry orated it from memory, it's called "Get Drunk." And the meaning of it is a little bit lost when you hear it one or two times when he's done it, and it's great. He does a great job with it. But as I learned about the meaning of it, it's really get intoxicated, and by intoxication, just become immersed. Larry changes the word in the poem from wine to beer, and I think I'd just like to leave it with wine because there are other things that are going on in that poem. So I'm going to try to read it if you don't mind.
Sure.
It's Charles Baudelaire. It's called Get Drunk. One should always be drunk. That's the great thing. The only question. Not to feel the horrible burden of time weighing on your shoulders and bowing you to the earth. You should get drunk without respite. Drunk with what? With wine, with poetry, or virtue, as you please, but get drunk. And if sometimes you should happen to awake on the stairs of a palace, on the green grass of a ditch, in the dreary solitude of your own room, and find that your drunkenness is ebbing or has vanished, ask the wind, the wave, ask star, bird, or clock, ask everything that flies, everything that moans, everything that flows, everything that sings, everything that speaks, ask them the time, and the wind, the wave, the star, the bird, and the clock will all reply, it is time to get drunk. If you are not to be the martyred slaves of time, be perpetually drunk, with wine, with poetry, or virtue, as you please.
That's perfect.
Yeah. It's just become immersed in people, relationships, whatever your academic pursuits are, and you'll do okay.
Well, thanks, Rob. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Well, Dave Conz, welcome to Basic Brewing Radio.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
Now, first of all, tell me, I'm assuming that you're a home brewer yourself, right?
Correct.
Give me some background. How long have you been brewing, and what do you like to brew?
So I started making cider in late 2009 because I was talking to my great uncle who's currently 93, I want to say, and he was telling me the process that he went through to help my great-grandfather, his dad, make cider illegally during Prohibition in eastern Pennsylvania on their farm, and they would sell it out of the barn all weekend long for 25 cents a gallon. So I thought, well, that is awesome. So I started making cider the easy way, kind of like the prison wine method. I would use champagne yeast, cane sugar, and just off-the-shelf cheap apple juice. And it stinks kind of like sulfur, but it's delicious, and it's about 16 to 18% ABV, and it's a hit at parties. So I wouldn't consider that home brewing, but it's definitely home fermenting. And I still do cider. I do 6-gallon batches, dump in 5 or 10 pounds of sugar, sprinkle some champagne yeast, and just let it go. I don't even use an airlock. I barely sanitize. It's really sloppy. But when I brew beer, I'm much more serious. And the reason I started making beer was that I proposed my dream course at Arizona State, where I'm faculty in interdisciplinary studies, and I research at the Center for Nanotechnology and Society. And I was in the front office, and at that time, this is early 2010, winter of 2010, I had just toured Yuengling, America's oldest brewery, near my hometown. I grew up in Sunbury, Pennsylvania, and Yuengling is in Pottsville. And I got to go into their caverns because, of course, when they were brewing in 1829, they didn't have artificial refrigeration, so they would lager their beer in the hillside, in the cave. So they only opened them up for tours periodically. So I got to go in there, and I was discussing this with the office staff at ASU, and my at the time, new director walked by, and he's from Milwaukee. So even though he doesn't drink, he knows the importance of beer as an industry. And he said, well, that would be a really interesting interdisciplinary class, talk about beer. And I kind of laughed it off at first. And then as the days went by, I thought this would be the best class in the world. So I proposed the course. I call it the Cultural and Chemical History of Beer. It's BIS 402. It's a senior capstone course. And I proposed the course. I drew up a syllabus, submitted it to the curriculum committee, and miraculously it went up the chain and got approved. And I've been teaching at least 2 sections every semester, including summers, ever since fall of 2010. And it just gets more fun each semester. I try to bring in new sources. I bring in some really great people. April 9th, coming up in a week or two, I have Fritz Maytag coming, former owner of Anchor, and I would consider the father of all craft beer. So he's coming back to the class, and I just had George Hancock, formerly of Pyramid, and now he owns Phoenix Ale Brewery here in town. And I did have Charlie Papazian. I mean, not to name drop, but it's exciting because I don't have a budget, so I had a really great friend and grad student who basically said, hey, do you want me to help bring in guest speakers? I said, sure, whatever. So he emailed all of his craft beer heroes, and most of them agreed to come, even though I can't offer them anything except a couple beers and a venue to speak to some really interested and interesting students. So
wow.
It's worked out really well.
Well, you never know what you'll get until you ask, right?
Exactly. So it's been great, and I've been able to create some relationships with local brewers, homebrew store owners, distributors, pub owners. It's been fantastic. We just did a optional class field trip to the Crescent Crown Distributing. It's one of the largest distributors in America. They have a huge craft beer portfolio, although their main customer is Miller Coors. But they have this colossal, brand new warehouse a few miles from campus in Mesa, Arizona. And just to see how they handle the supply chain is amazing. They have about 750,000 cases of beer in the warehouse at any given time, and it's completely turned over every 21 days.
Wow.
So just to see, if you've ever seen the original Indiana Jones movie, the very end, when they're warehousing the Ark of the Covenant in that giant, government secret warehouse, that's what this warehouse for Crescent Crown looks like. It's amazing. It's baffling to see millions of gallons of beer before your eyes. It's amazing.
So instead of the Ark of the Covenant, it's a case of Miller Lite.
Yes, exactly. And they have a really interesting program. So their director of marketing and sales training comes and guest lectures, and then he does the tour. But he also created a program in-house there that's a homebrew competition for their employees. And it helps them with team building and also learning about different styles of beer. And I've been judging for that for a number of years now with some local craft brewers and brewery owners. I'm not a Cicerone or BJCP certified, but I am headed in that direction. So I'm kind of doing the 3-year plan for beer judge certification.
Sure. Well, cool. What's your goal with the class that you teach? I mean, what do you want the students to take away from it?
That's a great question. So because it's an interdisciplinary program, the students come from different substantive perspectives in terms of their areas of concentration. They each choose 2 areas of concentration. Could be business, communication, religious studies, biochemistry, Spanish. There's about 150 options. So I always have a different audience, different group of students. But my goal is to use beer as, if you think of beer as a technological artifact, you can take it in any number of directions. So the course is set up to be about 20% biochemistry and 80% social and cultural and political history. And the students can then customize their research projects. I require them to attend at least 4 cultural beer events, and I'm using air quotes as I say that. So they can go to Tour de Fat when it comes through town. They can go to an Oktoberfest. They can go to a tasting, a festival. And they're not required nor encouraged to drink, but if they are 21, and the vast majority of them are, they're typically graduating seniors, they will attend an event and then write a cultural analysis, if you will. It's just a very brief 2 to 4 page paper on what they saw and how it ties into their areas of concentration. Then to entice them to do a little DIY stuff, if they choose the homebrew option and write up a lab report, that counts as 2 cultural events. And we do brew together as a class. In the fall, we made the presidential honey porter that the White House recipe that was released in the early fall or late summer.
Sure. And
this semester we did. Actually, we did the presidential porter in the spring. In the fall, we did a pumpkin ale, and then this semester we did a milk stout that I have on nitro right now.
So do you guys? How creative do the students get with their homebrewing?
That's a great question. I've been really impressed, especially in recent semesters. It seems every semester I have a higher proportion of students who have homebrewing experience. And I typically reserve 1 or 2 seats for non-interdisciplinary studies majors. And currently I have a food and beverage, I guess it's called. I'm not sure what his major is actually, but he's been homebrewing for years. And he's been experimenting with a lot of IPAs, a lot of major hop additions, and some big beers. I've had students do Russian Imperial Stout that they've aged in oak whiskey barrels. I've had some students experiment with different herbs and fruits with saisons and farmhouse ales, different experiments with sours, stuff that I personally don't really delve into much because I love milk stout. So pretty much every 2 or 3 batches I make some milk stout. this Monday I'm planning to do an all-grain Irish red. But the students not only impress me with their creativity in terms of their recipes, but also when they fabricate their own apparatus, their own mash slaughter tons, their own wort chillers, etc. That's what really interests me, is the creativity that goes into both the recipes and the process equipment. So I guess that's three things. But
so if I'm a parent and my my son or daughter is enrolled in your class, convince me that it's not a blow-off class where people can drink beer for credit.
That is an absolutely legitimate concern, and it's one that I don't encounter as much as I had anticipated. But typically the reaction I get, whether it's from a parent or a colleague or somebody sitting next to me at the airport, they laugh. Well, first they are somewhat incredulous as to whether they even heard me right. They said, did you say computers? I said, no, I said beer. I teach beer at ASU. Then they get a little curious and they say, well, first of all, why wasn't that class offered when I went there? And then second, what's that class about? So it is true that ASU has a reputation as a party school, but the easiest way to convince a non-believer is to start talking about just the basic biochemistry and in terms of how yeast perform fermentation, which to me is like magic. It makes me really full of awe about the physical world. But also, I talk about it from an historic perspective, or if I mention that it's one of the few segments of American business right now that's been growing in double digits for the last few years, then they start to take it somewhat seriously. So I don't know if you're convinced yet, but I can keep trying.
Well, I mean, it from my perspective, I mean, I've got a 16-year-old and a 13-year-old, both of them boys, and if my sons were to go to school, what would appeal to me as a parent would be exposing my sons to beer on a multi-dimensional scale. I mean, when I went to school, it was just the yellow fizzy stuff, and it was, it didn't matter what the label was on the outside or how much it cost. It all seemed to taste the same, and there was only one goal in consuming it, and it wasn't the flavor. So that's not a healthy relationship with beer.
Right.
So I would think that this class would at least give them some perspective on it, and maybe a healthier relationship with it, and to educate them on not only the positive sides, but possibly the negative sides as well.
Right, and we do spend some time in class focusing on some of the really important negatives that can come along with alcohol. So we talk about physiology, we talk about the toxicity and the stages of intoxication. We talk about long-term physical harm. We talk about the dangers of driving under the influence. And Arizona has very strict DUI laws. First offense requires 24 hours in Tent City, which you may have heard of. It's an outdoor jail, which is, I hear, very unpleasant in the summer when the temperatures reach 115 degrees. But I encourage the students, like very first day of class, I give them the syllabus and I give them a copy of the periodic table of beer styles, or the periodic table, which has 64 or so major styles, and it's organized, if you haven't seen it, it's organized in the same way that periodic table of elements is organized in chemistry class. But some of the students come to class having never drank beer or only had the yellow fizzy stuff, or they say they don't like beer, and I want to expose them to the wide varieties, the history. We watch How Beer Saved the World, the somewhat tongue-in-cheek documentary that Discovery produced.
Yeah.
And I also require them to watch the very excellent Ken Burns PBS documentary on Prohibition. It's about 5.5 hours long, but I do require them to watch that. It's a required viewing. So one of the things that fascinates me is that it seems we're getting more and more evidence that the entire agricultural revolution and really the basis of civilization and a sedentary agrarian lifestyle wasn't because we wanted to make bread, even though bread's great, but because we wanted to brew beer. And in fact, there's some interesting research coming out of archaeology and anthropology departments around the U.S. that suggest we have evidence that we humans were making beer 3,000 to 5,000 years before we were baking bread. And that kind of makes sense because, like I said, bread's delicious and everything, but imagine you're a cave dweller nomad and you stumble upon some, puddle full of naturally fermented beer and you drink it. I don't know why you would drink it, but if you drink it, it'd start to feel a little interesting, and then you'd want to be able to intentionally recreate that process, and I think that makes sense.
Yeah, if you look at the process of making beer, and how intricate it is, and how complex it is, that it didn't happen all at once. Somebody didn't sit down and say, I think I'm going to decide to make some beer.
Right.
The stages in how you get from seed and how you malt and how you mash and then how you boil and then how you each one of those stages has complexities in its own. So you could tell just from looking at that it was an evolutionary process that happened over a long period of time.
Absolutely.
And there's an indication in there that you'd have to have communication and you'd have to have a civilization kind of around that to facilitate not only the development of that process, but then the communication of that process to other pods of the civilization, say, to pass that on from one generation to another and one area to another. So,
absolutely.
So beer is just on the face of it, an indication of how civilization works. How's that?
Definitely. If you look at some of the major technological breakthroughs, like Louis Pasteur's discovery of the function of yeast, his process of pasteurization for milk, we usually associate with milk, but it was actually applied to beer before it was applied to dairy. The refrigerated railroad car was first used to transport lager. The artificial refrigeration itself was first used, I should say, in breweries. So it's really a driver of technological innovation. And one of the things I'm interested in as a social scientist is how that spirit continues today at the small scale, at the homebrew scale, at the DIY backyard brewer scale. And there's some really fascinating innovation going on. If you just scour the internet, you can find open source plans for Arduino controlled temperature thermostats for your fermenter that you can build yourself for $20-$30. And I think that the same spirit that goes into creating beer or experimenting with a new style also translates into that desire to do it yourself, to create something, to make something. And I've seen it among homebrewers spill over into food. A lot of the homebrewers I know are also gourmet cooks. They tend to be creative in terms of whether it's engineering or artistic or musical. They tend to be very creative. And of course, beer in moderate amounts will lower one's inhibitions. It's a very social beverage. The process of brewing is a social process. I tell my students, making beer at home alone is almost as sad as drinking beer home alone. It's a very social endeavor in that it's something you do with your friends, and you enjoy the fruits of your labor together as well. So,
I spend a lot of time being sad. I brew alone a lot, of course. But then nowadays with Twitter and Facebook and all that, you're never really alone anymore.
That's a good point.
All you have to do is post a picture somewhere of your brew pot, and you've got friends all of a sudden talking to you from around the world.
That's a really good point.
The article that got my attention and brought me to you was I found it on Slate, and the title of it is "What Beer Can Teach Us About Emerging Technologies: The Homebrew Movement Serves as a Lesson in DIY Innovation." And you're basically saying, you're touching on it now, but you're basically saying that home brewing and the do-it-yourself stuff that people seem to be getting into is sort of an important component of a healthy civilization.
Yes, I think I share the critique that some other scholars and pundits have levied at American culture, in that we've become so dependent on stuff made by others. We've become consumers to the nth degree. If you go to the grocery store now, you can buy pre-sliced apples. You can buy pre-hard-boiled and peeled eggs. And at some point, there comes a stage, I think, in civilization where we go down a dead-end path. And I think what we're seeing now is a resurgence of cottage industry, of the maker movement, the spirit of basically the way our parents or grandparents were raised, that you do it yourself, not because you are forced to, but because you want to experience the satisfaction and accomplishment of actually creating something. Mm-hmm. And we've been using shopping and consumption and consumerism as a surrogate for that. So we feel good when we buy something new and we can show it off. But I've found personally, and I've also discovered in my interviews with both homebrewers and other DIY people, that there's so much satisfaction that comes from actually creating something physical. So we've all become knowledge workers. We all ride the tides of information, but most of us have lost the ability to make something with our own two hands. And I think that's one of the main motivators for homebrewers. It's not that they can't go out and buy great craft beer. It's not that they're necessarily trying to save money, although you can save a lot of money and make better beer yourself, as you know. But there's something fundamentally rewarding about saying, I made this, or we made this. And one of the things, I'm not sure if I mentioned it in the Slate article, which was very fun to write, by the way, but one of the things I study for work is the rise of hacker spaces or maker spaces, which essentially are clubhouses or gyms for nerds. So instead of going to a gym to lift weights and run on a treadmill, you go to a hackerspace to make stuff. So they are well equipped with laser cutters, 3D printers, milling machines, woodworking machines, fabric and textile machines, and you go and make stuff. Huh. And what I thought, which was wrong, I thought people joined so that they could have access to that equipment. That's really not the primary motivator. The primary motivator I'm discovering is the sense of community and belonging to a group of like-minded creative makers. About 20 years ago, there were probably a dozen hacker spaces around the world, and now there are over 1,400. So that's telling us something. So I think, one of the ways I frame it, as others have done, is we've lost our shop classes from our K through 12 curriculum. We've lost home ec in favor of computer classes. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I believe that the rise in makerspaces and hackerspaces is because of that void that we've left ourselves without the knowledge and skill and drive to make stuff. So one thing I've noticed that will interest you and your listeners is that a lot of the hackerspaces have a homebrewing component. Probably the largest in the country is in rural Boston. It's in Somerville, Massachusetts, called Artisans Asylum, and it's this colossal 50 or 60,000 square foot space, and everybody kind of has their own little cubicle. There's an electric brewery there that's all fully automatic, Arduino controlled. I've even taught homebrewing classes at the hackerspace that I go to. So there's a perfect alignment, I think, between homebrewers and the broader DIY maker movement. But what's interesting to me about homebrewing is that it's been going on for probably 8,000, 10,000 years, even before we had homes. So it brings both the ancient craft and skill alongside of the high-tech stuff, like I mentioned earlier, with the Arduino-controlled fermenters. And I even saw one that's, I'm not quite sure how practical it is, but it's an app you can get for your smartphone that will update you in real time how your batch is progressing in terms of temperatures and times. But I like to be in the same place when I'm making beer as the beer, so I'm not sure why you would use that remote sensing, but I guess you could share it with your friends and with your virtual friends.
Well, my friend Andy, who owns the local homebrew shop here in Northwest Arkansas, has his electric brewery hooked up to the internet so that on brew day he can just roll over in bed and pick up his iPad and start the hot liquor tank going, so that
Excellent.
He can set the temperature, then roll back and go back to sleep for a few more minutes, and then when he walks into the garage, it's ready to go.
That's pretty phenomenal.
Yeah. Well, you say that this has been going on for thousands of years, but the pace of innovation nowadays, thanks to the internet and thanks to communications and thanks to podcasts and YouTube videos and online forums and all kinds of things, the rate of innovation has got to be exponentially faster than it was even 30 years ago, 20 years ago.
Absolutely. This is something I was just discussing in a graduate class yesterday. Before science was an actual profession, before science was an institution, we had the wealthy gentlemen tinkerers who would go out into their workshops and do experiments. So they would, they'd have a dead frog and a battery, and they would electrocute the dead frog, and the legs would move, and they'd say, "Wow, that's pretty interesting." And then they would write a letter to their other wealthy friends. This is called epistolary science. And then they would replicate the experiment and write a letter back, and 6 months would go by. And then eventually they formed the Royal Society, and then they eventually became more systematic in their peer review. But as you just very astutely mentioned, the pace of that process is now almost instantaneous. So I can be in the middle of a brew and I can forget something, and I can just post a question to a homebrew forum, and I can expect an expert response within minutes. And that to me is so exciting and so phenomenal. So when I first started studying this DIY maker movement about 11 years ago, and I was studying people who made their own biodiesel fuel at home from waste vegetable oil, and I've been doing that myself for about 10 years. It's actually easier than making beer, which is pretty funny. But back then, we didn't have YouTube, and we didn't have the bandwidth that could even handle it. So we had discussion forums, and that's mostly how people would learn. But there's tacit knowledge that is difficult to convey without seeing it, seeing something done, seeing something demonstrated. And that applies to homebrewing as well. So now, as you mentioned, if I want to teach my students how to measure original gravity of a wort sample, I still bring my hydrometer into class because I like to do show and tell, but I will just pull up a YouTube video because there are dozens of excellent videos that will allow me to not have to bring a beer sample or a wort sample into class and accidentally spill it on the floor, which I've done before. I can just pull up a video and they can, in 2 minutes, they can say, oh, wow, that's how you measure the specific gravity of a wort sample. And to me, that's just great, because when I was first learning how to make biodiesel, it took me months to figure out how to titrate the waste vegetable oil to discover how many free fatty acids were in it and how much caustic I would have to add, etc. But now there are dozens of videos to show me how to do that. So it's a very exciting time for people to get into hobbies like home brewing, and pretty much every city with a population above 10,000 has a homebrew store, at least in my experience. Maybe not across the entire country. But if your town doesn't have a homebrew store, there are dozens of sources on the internet where you can buy your ingredients and get them delivered to your house. It's really exciting.
Is there with the proliferation of homebrewers and of craft brewers, here in Northwest Arkansas, just over the past year, I think 5 new small breweries popped up where we just had one before for several years. Is there a downside to that? I mean, are there examples in the cultural history that we can see where there was kind of an explosion of innovation or an explosion of activity in a certain area, and that there were adverse effects?
So 2 things come to mind, 2 historical moments, if you will. One was pretty interesting. I come from mostly German roots. If you look at the history of immigration in the U.S., ales and ciders were very popular until about the middle of the 19th century, when the wave of German and Irish immigrants came over. The Germans, of course, were all about lager. This kind of eclipsed the production of cider because it's much easier to grow barley than it is apples en masse. So that's kind of one somewhat related example of a shift in cultural taste. But in terms of industry, the biggest catastrophe to brewing was Prohibition.
Mm-hmm.
And we went from about 2,000 breweries or 3,000 breweries maybe before 1920 to just maybe a half dozen or so by World War II, because most of them just went out of business. Yuengling is one of the only ones that survived by selling dairy like ice cream and near beer. But that was a really rough period from 1920 to 1933. The breweries couldn't stay in business. So right now we're just beginning to approach those numbers, those pre-Prohibition numbers. So I've heard estimates ranging from 2,000 to 2,500 breweries with, like you said, a new craft brewery opening somewhere in America almost every couple days. And I've seen this I just was in Denver over the weekend, Denver Boulder, which is fantastic beer country.
Mm-hmm.
I'm seeing the same trend here in central Arizona, in Phoenix and Tempe. There's breweries opening up or slated to open up in the next few months. I think because it's such a disproportionate industry in terms of the big 2, Anheuser-Busch InBev and Miller Coors, producing between 80 and 90% of the beer, craft brewers combined just recently surpassed 5% of the market. So I think there's still a lot of room for expansion, and because the craft beer scene, in terms of both producers and consumers and homebrewers, because it's so friendly, I think we're going to see a lot of cooperative competition, if you will, between the upstarts. And I think really what will dictate the success or failure of each new craft brewery is the quality of their product. So I just went to about 8 or 10 different breweries around the Denver area, and some were just outstanding. Most had at least 2 or 3 excellent beers, but Oscar Blues and Left Hand, just everything I tried was great. Avery's really great too.
Mm-hmm.
Great Divide is phenomenal. I think there's a lot of room for new breweries, and I think there's a lot of room I think we'll see a lot more experimentation. Just in the last few years, I've seen the trends go from super hoppy IPAs to bourbon barrel-aged beers, and now I'm seeing a lot of sours and Trappist-style beers popping up. I like the variety and the experimentation. So I go for quality and variety over quantity. But there's no reason. I mean, somebody might like to go out and, responsibly, not drive, of course, but go out and have, try 3 or 6 different beers, whether it's a 2-ounce taster or a proper pint. And because good quality beer is so enjoyable and easy to drink, I don't think we're going to see the numbers shrinking. We can't sustain double-digit increases forever, but I think we're going to see a lot more breweries popping up, and I think most of them will be successful.
Well, I like to tell people that I kind of look like, and I might have talked about this on the show before, but I kind of look at the brewery industry like the restaurant industry. I mean, you've got the national chains, and then you've got regional chains, and then you've got citywide chains, and then you got all the way down to the mom and pop diner,
right,
who all they do is breakfast and lunch. So there's room in that marketplace for a diversity of suppliers and a diversity of restaurants and food purveyors. So you got to think, or in my barely educated opinion, you've got to think that there something similar can come out of the way beer is shaping up.
Right, and I think you're correct, and I think that's a good analogy to compare, the food industry with beer. And what I'm seeing here in town is not only new breweries opening up, but new tap rooms and new pubs and new ale houses that don't necessarily brew, but they're installing 20 tap systems or 50 tap systems. And the biggest challenge that I've heard craft brewers cite isn't competition or expansion, but they just can't keep up with demand. They can't produce enough beer to meet the demand. So I think as we see more craft breweries opening and the word spreads, I think we're also seeing a rise in the consumers in terms of appreciating good quality craft beer. So we're getting a similar increase in both the breweries and new beer connoisseurs.
Well, it sounds like the future is bright, and it sounds like it's fun time to be in your job.
It certainly is. It's been very exciting, and I've met so many wonderful people, and you and I wouldn't have met, even though we're virtual right now. You and I wouldn't have met if it weren't for craft beer and the internet. So I really appreciate what you've been doing. I would consider you one of the pioneers because you've been doing it longer than most people.
Well, Dave, this has been fun.
Thank you very much, and keep doing what you're doing, and let's stay in touch. It was a real pleasure to speak with you today.
I'll post a link to Dave's Slate article in the description of this episode on basicbrewingradio.com, and I'll also post it on our Facebook page. And there you will also find a link to Rob Fullmer's blog post about his friend. Our condolences go out to Dave's family, his friends, and his students. We'll talk to you next week.